For years, Judge Miriam Halstead signed the orders, sealed the files, and silenced the families. She thought her robe made her untouchable, her courtroom a fortress. But when she targeted Congresswoman Delilah Monroe, accusing her of treason before a live national audience, she made one fatal mistake. She believed Monroe would break under pressure. She believed a grieving black woman wouldn't fight back. But when they picked Delilah, they didn't know who they were messing with. They didn't know she carried the last letter of a fallen soldier. They didn't know she was the voice for a family the government tried to forget. And what came next wasn't just justice, it was reckoning. A letter, a voice recording, a child's medal. One by one, the truths surfaced, dragging every lie into the light. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about one woman. It's about all of us. Outside, the courthouse stood still. The wind carried the hush of a nation holding its breath. Sunlight cut through clouds as if nature itself had paused, waiting for a verdict deeper than law. It began on a cold Wednesday morning in Washington, the kind that bit through wool coats and whispered of storms yet to come. The courthouse was already thick with tension by the time Delilah Monroe arrived. Congresswoman, daughter of Texas soil, and now the center of a televised inquisition that had captured the nation's attention. Cameras buzzed like hornets. Commentators speculated with hungry eyes, but Delilah, dressed in a modest gray suit and worn leather heels, walked the marble corridor alone. No lawyers, no bodyguards, just her breath, steady and deliberate, like someone bracing for a wind only she could see. Inside Courtroom 3C, Judge Miriam Halstead, a towering figure in American jurisprudence, sat with the poise of a woman who'd built her legacy on sharp rulings and sharper silences. Without preamble, she leaned forward and delivered her words like a blade. Congresswoman Monroe, you stand accused of concealing classified documents pertaining to Operation Whisperfield. This court holds evidence of treason. Gasps surged through the gallery. Whispers turned into low rumblings of doubt and suspicion. Delilah did not flinch. She simply placed her briefcase on the defense table and folded her hands. There was no trembling, no denial, no plea. Only stillness. What would you do if the whole world turned against you, and you were forced to carry the truth in silence? Judge Halstead's voice was cold, rehearsed, almost gleeful in its pronouncement. This wasn't a trial, it was a public execution of legacy, of honor. Delilah, a black woman who had risen from poverty to the halls of Congress, was being offered up for judgment, not by law, but by spectacle. And yet, something in her eyes unnerved even her fiercest critics. They weren't the eyes of a guilty woman. They were deeper, quieter, like the dark stillness before a storm cracks open. The sky. That morning began with an accusation, but it would not end the way they expected. And isn't that often the way with truth? It doesn't arrive with fanfare. It waits, quiet, patient, until the world is finally ready to listen. The courtroom buzzed with the hum of barely restrained anticipation. Reporters scribbled notes. Photographers jostled for position. Delilah Monroe sat motionless, hands still folded, her eyes fixed not on the judge, but on the leather briefcase beside her. It was worn at the edges, its brass clasp dulled with time. An ordinary thing, until she opened it. Delilah didn't speak right away. The judge leaned forward, as if to strike the next blow. But instead of defending herself, Delilah pulled out a letter, creased, yellowed, and torn slightly at the fold. With a reverence that made the room still, she unfolded it and placed it carefully before her. Then she stood. "My name," she began softly, "is not the most important one in this room today." She raised the letter in her hands. "This is from Nadine Carter, a mother, a nurse, a woman whose only child, Private Deshaun Carter, never came home. A hush fell. Somewhere in the gallery, a senator cleared his throat too loudly. The judge furrowed her brow. But Delilah continued, her voice trembling, not from fear, but from something heavier. They told her it was an accident. They told her it was classified. They told her to move on. She paused, swallowing hard. But mothers know when they're being lied to. And then she read. My Deshaun always smiled before bed. The last time I saw him, he said he'd be back to fix the squeaky fence. He never liked leaving things broken. A low sob broke from someone in the back row. Tell me, Delilah asked the room, her voice suddenly sharp. What does a mother do when the government buries her son beneath redacted lines in silence? The silence that followed wasn't courtroom silence. It was sacred, the kind of silence that only comes when something truthful pierces deeper than the law. Judge Halstead shifted in her seat, visibly unsettled. What she had expected was a defense. What she received was a reckoning. And in that stillness, one truth was undeniable. This was no longer about Delilah Monroe. This was about every voice that had been silenced before her. The room hadn't breathed in minutes. Delilah let the letters settle into the silence like ash after a fire. Then, without ceremony, she reached once more into her briefcase and retrieved a second document. Thicker, bound in twine, stamped once with a long faded top, secret across the top. She stepped forward and laid it on the evidence table. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady now, steadier than before. This, she said, is the after-action report for Operation Whisperfield, the same operation that cost Deshaun Carter his life. Gasps fluttered through the gallery. A few reporters dropped their pens. Judge Halstead leaned forward instinctively, scanning the cover. This document was sealed for over a year, redacted, hidden, classified beyond reach. But last week I received an unredacted version. Every timestamp, every failed transmission, every soldier listed by name, including the one you claimed died instantly. She turned and faced the judge, locking eyes. Your signature is here, Your Honor. You authorized the mission. You funded the private contractor who supplied the defective signal jammers. And you knew they had failed before the operation even launched. A stunned juror leaned forward. The gallery buzzed, disoriented. The storm had arrived. What happens to a system when those who write the rules are the first to break them? Delilah pointed to the final page. Right there. Judge Miriam Halstead, authorizing officer. Your initials next to the words, Operational Risk Acceptable. Judge Halstead's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Her hands clenched the edge of the bench, knuckles whitening. But Delilah wasn't done. She held up a photo, grainy but clear. The judge, seated at a Georgetown restaurant, smiling beside Wallace Greer, CEO of Titan Tech Defense, the same firm responsible for the equipment failure. It wasn't just poor judgment. It was personal. This time, the silence didn't fall. It collapsed. And in that collapse, something shifted. Delilah was no longer the accused. She was the mirror. A mirror held up to power, asking it, will you look or will you break? Just as the weight of Delilah's revelations settled over the room like dust after an explosion, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Every head turned instinctively, like the air itself had shifted. And there, framed in the doorway, stood a small, elderly woman in a fire-red coat. She walked with a cane, her silver-gray hair pulled tight in a bun, her steps slow but purposeful. One hand clutched the cane, the other pressed a folded photograph tightly to her chest. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Delilah turned the moment she heard the cane tapping against the floor, and her face, composed through fire, broke. Not in fear, but in recognition. This was Eunice Carter, Nadine's mother, Deshaun's grandmother. No one had called her to testify. She was not on any list. And yet, she came, as if summoned not by law, but by love. and a deep shock fell as she made her way down the aisle step by measured step. The judge sat frozen. Even the court bailiff instinctively stepped forward, but stopped at a simple wave of her hand. Have you ever seen someone walk into a room and change its temperature just by being there? When she reached the front, Delilah reached out to steady her. Their eyes met. A soft nod passed between them. Permission, blessing, history. Judge Halstead didn't object when Eunice took the witness stand. She did. The old woman adjusted the microphone slowly. Her voice, when it came, was roughened by years and sorrow, but unshakable. My grandson was 19, she said. His mother, my daughter, buried him with a folded flag and no answers. And then she buried herself. A single tear tracked down her cheek, but she did not stop. You told us he died a hero, but you didn't tell us he died because someone with power decided the truth was inconvenient. A juror covered her mouth. A reporter lowered his camera. Judge Halstead bowed her head slightly. For the first time. And for a moment, it didn't feel like a courtroom anymore. It felt like a reckoning. After Eunice Carter's testimony, the courtroom lingered in a stunned hush. Even the judge's gavel would have felt too loud, too blunt, for the moment that had just passed. But then another name was quietly called, and from the side door, a woman stepped forward. Narrow-shouldered, modest blouse, a hospital name tag still pinned to her coat. Her name was Susan Hale, a former Army nurse. She didn't carry papers, didn't ask for water. She simply adjusted the microphone with trembling hands and began. I was on duty the night Private Deshaun Carter arrived at Fort Bright Light Medical. The audience straightened. Delilah's fingers curled around the edge of her seat. It was chaos, Susan continued. They told us a blast. No details, classified. Just that we needed to stabilize whoever we could. She paused, her voice tightening. But Deshaun wasn't dead when they brought him in. He was breathing. Barely. For 27 minutes, he was alive. A soft gasp rolled through the courtroom like thunder in reverse. Susan's voice cracked, but she didn't stop. He kept repeating one question, over and over again. Does my mom know I wasn't supposed to be there? And have you ever heard something so simple it broke you in half? She looked out at the courtroom, her eyes raw. He didn't die instantly like the report said. He died confused, scared, asking if someone would tell her the truth. Delilah blinked. Hard. Even Judge Halstead shifted, her lips parting slightly, her eyes cast low. For a brief moment, the courtroom didn't feel like an arena of power. It felt like a memory, a sacred one, wrapped in regret. Susan swallowed, adding one final line. He died believing something was wrong, and he died not knowing whether anyone would ever speak up for him. The room held its breath, then exhaled in grief. And so did justice. For the first time in years, Delilah Monroe stood now, calm and composed, but her fingertips trembled slightly as she reached into her case one last time. From a small black pouch, she drew out a USB drive. Simple, unmarked, innocuous to the unknowing eye. But as she walked toward the court's evidence monitor, the air tightened again, as though the walls themselves braced for what was coming. If it pleases the court, she said, her voice measured, I have one final piece of evidence. Not a document, not a photo, a voice. She inserted the drive and stepped aside. The courtroom darkened slightly as the overhead screen flickered to life. For a beat, there was nothing. Then the speakers filled with a voice, clear, composed, and chilling in its confidence. If the mother pushes too hard, we'll release a statement suggesting her son violated protocol. That'll kill the story before it begins. The voice was unmistakable. Judge Miriam Halstead. A collective gasp erupted, followed by a terrifying silence. Reporters froze mid-sentence. Jurors turned to one another in disbelief. Even the bailiff's hand twitched against his holster, as if instinctively reaching for something steady. Have you ever heard someone's true character, not in what they confess, but in what they never meant to be heard? Delilah turned slowly, no triumph in her expression, only gravity. This recording, she said softly, was made 3 months after Deshaun Carter's death, provided by a former staffer who couldn't live with what she'd heard. The judge's lips parted, but no words followed. Her hands gripped the bench like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her carefully constructed mask, the one forged over decades of courtrooms and control, was beginning to fracture. A defense attorney muttered something about protocol, about admissibility, but no one was listening. Because truth, once spoken, doesn't need permission. And when it finally breaks free, who among us is brave enough to face what it reveals? No one spoke. Not the attorneys, not the judge, not the stunned observers in the gallery whose silence had turned reverent, like a congregation in the presence of something holy. Delilah stepped away from the monitor, her expression unreadable, and walked to the side of the courtroom. A bailiff opened the rear door with a glance, and in came something unexpected. Not a witness, not another file. A chair, wooden, scuffed, slightly lopsided at one leg, the kind of chair that belongs in kitchens, tucked beneath tables heavy with memory. Delilah carried it gently, 2 hands beneath the seat, as if it were more fragile than it looked. She placed it beside the witness box, not ceremoniously, but with quiet care. This, she said, turning back to the court, was Deshaun Carter's kitchen chair. A ripple of disbelief passed through the gallery. Some tilted their heads, others frowned, unsure. But Delilah continued. Used it for homework, for breakfast, for late-night snacks with his mother. Before he left for basic training, he told her not to let anyone else sit in it. He said, "I'll be back for it." Her voice broke, just barely, and then steady again, but he never got the chance. How many empty chairs sit in our homes, quietly grieving someone we never got to welcome back? Delilah crouched next to the chair, running her fingers across the worn wood. It's just furniture, I know. But to his mother it was a promise. To his grandmother it was a reminder. And now, to all of us, it's a question. She rose slowly. Who gets to come home? And who gets erased before they ever had the chance? From the front row a child began to cry. Soft, restrained, but real. No one hushed him, not this time. And in that sound, a boy's honest ache. Something opened wider than law. The courtroom hadn't just seen injustice. It had now felt it. As Delilah stepped back from the chair, the silence was almost sacred, the kind that hums in your chest like a held breath across 1,000 hearts. Then, from the front row, a small voice broke through. "Excuse me." It was barely a whisper, but the room heard it. A boy, no more than 9 or 10, stood slowly. His cheeks were wet. His shirt was too big, the collar askew, and his shoes, polished but clearly his older brother's, clacked as he stepped into the aisle. He held something small in his hands, clasped tightly like it might vanish. Delilah turned, instinctively kneeling to meet him eye to eye. "My name's Caleb," he said, his voice shaking. "My big brother was James. He died 2 years ago. They said it was complicated." He opened his palms. Resting inside was a worn silver medal with a frayed ribbon, the kind you only touch when you miss someone so much it hurts your chest. "My mom said," Caleb continued, "that if someone ever told the truth, we should give 'em this." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Not shock, but something deeper. Recognition. A child's offering of belief in a world that rarely gives children reasons to believe. Have you ever seen a child carry the weight of a truth too big for his age and still step forward anyway? Delilah took the medal gently, like it was made of glass. Her fingers closed around it, and for the first time since the trial began, her tears fell freely. Not from defeat, not from despair, but from the unbearable beauty of being seen by someone so small and so brave. You did, Caleb whispered, his lip trembling. You told it. Delilah nodded, her voice caught in her throat. Thank you, Caleb, for remembering him and for helping us all remember what matters. In that moment, medals didn't belong to generals or graves. They belonged to truth. By the time Delilah Monroe stepped out of the courthouse that afternoon, the sky above Washington had shifted. Heavy clouds giving way to pale sun, like the city itself was exhaling. But what waited outside was not a press frenzy. It was something far quieter and far more powerful. Thousands had gathered behind the barriers. No chants, no shouting, just presence. Veterans in dress blues stood shoulder to shoulder, their medals catching the light. Mothers clutched framed photos of sons and daughters, some fresh, some faded by years of waiting. Children too young to understand redacted files or classified lies held candles and signs made in crayon. One read simply, "Tell the truth." Delilah didn't raise a fist. She didn't wave. She held two things close to her chest, the silver medal from Caleb and the letter from Nadine Carter. She walked slowly, every step measured, as if the weight of every hidden story now rested on her shoulders. And in return, the crowd did not erupt. They stood, still, reverent, unified not by rage but by something older, memory. What does it say about a nation when silence feels more honest than words? Near the front, a woman with silver-streaked hair began to cry, quiet, trembling sobs. Next to her, a Marine veteran removed his cover, lowered his head, and saluted without a sound. These were not acts of protest. They were rituals of acknowledgement. Delilah paused near the steps, her eyes wet but steady. A single nod passed from her to the crowd, a gesture so small it might have been missed. But they saw. I see you. I carry you. It was not victory. It was something rarer. Justice without celebration, and healing without forgetting. 3 weeks later, the House chamber stood in unison. Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, divided by nearly everything, rose together as the final vote was cast. The Carter Act, named in honor of Nadine and Deshaun Carter, passed unanimously. It mandated transparency for all military operations resulting in service member deaths. No more sealed folders, no more buried truths. Delilah Monroe sat in the back, her fingers gently tracing the crease of Nadine's letter tucked into her coat. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. 2 days after the bill passed, a new memorial was unveiled in a quiet corner of Arlington National Cemetery. It wasn't large, no soaring statue, just a long black wall, smooth granite, simple and strong. Etched into its face were names, not just the well-known, not just the decorated, but the redacted, the forgotten, the deliberately erased. Deshaun Carter's name was there, so was James, the boy Caleb had honored with his medal. Dozens of others followed, stretching across stone-like rivers of memory. Delilah stood before the flame at the center, then reached into her pocket and pulled out an envelope. Handwritten, folded, worn at the edges. She slid it gently beneath the flame's base. It read, "I kept my promise." A veteran nearby leaned toward her, noticing the handwriting. "That yours?" he asked, squinting. "Little crooked." Delilah let out a soft laugh, the first in weeks. "I never said I was a calligrapher." The man smiled. "Doesn't have to be perfect," he replied. "You already made it unforgettable." What does it mean to live in a world where truth must fight so hard to be heard? As the sun dipped behind the trees, the wall shimmered under golden light. Each name was more than a memory. It was proof. Proof that silence costs lives. That power, when unchecked, writes history in vanishing ink. But now that ink had been replaced with stone. And stone remembers. Sometimes, the truth doesn't come in a courtroom or behind a podium. Sometimes it sits quietly at a kitchen table, folded into an old letter or tucked inside a child's trembling hands. The story of Delilah Monroe reminds us that truth doesn't always roar, it often whispers. And when it does, it needs someone brave enough to listen and to carry it forward. Many of us, especially in our later years, have seen what silence can cost. We've watched moments pass where someone should have said something, but didn't. Maybe we've even been that someone. But it's never too late to be the voice that breaks that silence. Not for applause, not for credit, but because dignity, justice, and memory matter. The world moves fast now, louder than ever, but this story asks us to pause and to remember. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is speak up, gently but firmly, for those who no longer can, even if our voice shakes, especially if it shakes. Because healing begins the moment truth is spoken with love. And maybe, just maybe, that's how the world begins to change, one honest word at a time. It ended not with a headline, not with applause, but with a kitchen light glowing softly in the dusk. Delilah Monroe, back home, stood at the window as her daughter laughed in the other room, the warmth of life returning in quiet waves. No victory speech, no crowd, just the sound of healing beginning, slow, steady, real. That's the kind of strength the world rarely celebrates, the quiet power to survive, to speak, and to stay standing. In the weeks that followed, policies were rewritten, memorials were built, but more importantly, stories once buried were finally brought to light. The echoes of injustice had not disappeared, but they no longer went unchallenged. In small towns, big cities, and quiet living rooms, people began to listen again, and in listening, they remembered. If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe to Echoes of Racism so these voices don't fade into silence. In the meantime, I've chosen 2 stories I think will move you just as much. Take care, and we'll see you soon.